Well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It's really terrific to be with you here today. My name is John Mancini. I think some of you know me. I was president of AIM for a gazillion years. Was also, for those of you with short memories, I was one of the keynote speakers this morning. And if you don't remember that, or if you slept in, make sure you go on and claim your free book. They're going like hotcakes, I am told, and there's just a few left. So make sure you hit that link and get it. We're gonna have three speakers today, and I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves so that I don't just read one of those nice canned kind of bios for each of them. And in terms of my role in this, if we were in the UK, I guess I would be called kind of the presenter, if you will, for the session. And I'll have a couple of comments to kick this off, and then I will be turning it over to my good friend Lori. And so why don't we click to the next slide. And so what I'd like to talk about, I'm here, I do a lot of work with the InfoTection people, and you'll hear from Vivek in a little while. And Vivek is the Chief Technical Officer at InfoTection. And the reason why I connected with InfoTection is I found them to be among the most knowledgeable people that I ran into in terms of M365 records and governance automation. And so I do a lot of work with them. And that's the hat, if you will, that I'll be wearing today. And I started intentionally with this slide because of the word strategy. And the reason I started with this is that I think it's really important right now. Preservation has always had this feel of something that you do later, something that you do someday, something that you put on the back burner and hope to get to someday. And there are a lot of reasons. I'll cover a couple of them. The rest of the speakers will expound upon them, why you need to really think about preservation from the perspective of something that you do right now and that you do in the context of creating information from the get-go. Because if you don't, you're going to fall hopelessly behind and you'll never really catch up in terms of where you need to be. Next slide, please. This is two questions that I asked when I had my AIM hat on to probably 1,000 people over the course of 2 years. And they really reflect the reason why this is so important to focus on right now. So the first question I would ask people, and these were people of all different levels and statures within an organization, is I would say, okay, tell me a little bit about the stream of information coming into your organization. And if it's X now, what do you expect it to be in 2 or 3 years? And the answer almost always came back 3.5, 4, 4.5X. So that's one metric associated with kind of the need for a strategy. But the second one is even more compelling when you think about preservation challenges, which is I also asked a question of what percentage of that information is unstructured or semi-structured? In other words, content, the kind of things that people in the records and information management community have cared about for a long time. And that answer always came back 55, 60, 65%. So you put those two together, and what it says to me is that there is a recipe for chaos in the marketplace right now, a recipe for chaos within the confines of each company and each governmental organization, and that unless you attack it on the front end, you will fall hopelessly behind. Next slide. And so I think every organization faces a strategic decision, and there are trade-offs in the preservation arena, like there are trade-offs everywhere. And I think one of the issues that you have to sort through is exactly what do you need to preserve, why do you need to preserve it, and in what form is that information right now? And so I think the strategy begins by building a business case that knows where you're starting and where you're going to stop, but you have to start someplace. And at each stage along the way, and Preservic has made this a whole lot easier than it used to be, but you have to measure this trade-off between value and effort when it comes to what you preserve and how you do it. Next slide. So this is the context in which we think about preservation. And this ECM context, if you will, is one that has been with us for a long time. And this slide is intentionally a little more simple than the real life world that we're in. but it's intended to highlight the fact that in the pre-cloud era, we had all sorts of different repositories out there. We still do, but that mosaic is changing a little bit, and I'll talk about that in a second. But you can see all the different sources of content in an organization. And within each of those sources of content are things that need to be preserved beyond the normal business schedule that you might have. And so again, this slide is intentionally a little more simple than the real life, because when you look at, for example, that ERP column and then pointing to that nice ECM repository, the reality is that most organizations have multiple content repositories and multiple shared drives. And all of that adds a degree of complexity that many organizations are trying to solve by transitioning to the cloud. Next slide. Now, what a lot of organizations are doing, and this is where InfoTection spends a lot of time, is thinking about which of those elements in the top half of the slide can be migrated into an M365 environment. And the benefits of that is that there are many robust governance and records capabilities within M365 that can be utilized in order to automate the whole process of governance. Now, I know there's a lot of folks, I hear people all the time that in a SharePoint environment tried to do records management and tried to do governance and were frustrated by that. And the reality is that there's a lot of truth to that. It was pretty tough in earlier iterations to do that. But the whole platform is in the process of changing. Vivek will talk a little bit about that. And so this question of, okay, if I'm going to try to automate governance, if I'm going to try to migrate to the cloud, how do I address preservation as that process occurs, rather than deferring it to some future date? Next slide. And so what we have, and this is an AIM data point from about a year ago, and I asked the same questions a year ago that I asked maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And it was interesting to me when I looked at that, because what the data said is that M365 has begun to embrace a number of traditional content management roles, and particularly in the arena of records management, and also in the arena of file shares and file sync and share. M365 has started to take over those kinds of roles from a lot of other players that once existed in the marketplace. Now, the challenge for all of you all is that that stuff doesn't go away overnight, that there is a hybrid nature to most worlds that organizations have to deal with. And you need a strategy that can transcend, that can go all the way from what you do on-prem to what you're doing in the cloud and everything in between. Next slide. And so when you think about this, the reason why we spend some time thinking about M365, particularly in part of this, is that most people have it in some way, shape, or form. When we asked the question in the AIM survey a year or two ago, do you have M365 on the left-hand side of the pie? You can see, just about everybody has it in some way, shape, or form. The other reason why it's particularly pertinent right now is that most organizations deployed Teams and everything that goes with Teams during the course of pandemic. And so the reason that creates challenges is that, even though a lot of people deployed Teams because it had pretty backgrounds and it provided video and IT approved of it and kind of all those kind of good things, it was also creating OneDrive repositories and SharePoint repositories every time a document was created. And so that has put a punctuation point for many organizations on the fact that they really need to think about ultimately what are they doing with all that content and what part of that needs to be preserved for the long term. Next slide, please. And so this question of migration, I think, becomes a real opportunity to rethink how you view preservation and to rethink it from the perspective as something that you want to automate. Because the reality is that people are going to be migrating content. They're not going to be migrating everything, but they are going to be migrating content. And so the challenge I would pose to people is that as you do that, as you think about how the role of different traditional ECM repositories change, as you think about how the role of M365 changes over time, it's a rich opportunity to think about preservation at that point in the decision matrix. And that's really, I think, where Preservica enters into the equation. The next slide. And this is my last one. It's a really good infotection slide. I would urge you to take a look at it because it talks about the question of, well, why automate? And I'm a big advocate for automation, and there's a couple reasons for that. And you can kind of get a nice capsule shot here that you can use in terms of advocacy with your own organization, in terms of this why automation question. But the reality is that the why answer is probably even simpler than this slide. The why automate is because knowledge workers don't care. And all the times that we have asked people to think seriously about this question of preservation and records, they pay lip service and they have other things to do. And so we have to try to automate as much of that as possible. And the second reason to automate is that the volume and variety, going back to the first slide that I shared, is just something that is eclipsing the ability to do this manually. So with that, I would like to switch gears and turn it over to my friend Lori. And next slide, please. And Lori, why don't you take it away?
Thanks, John. Great to be with you. Great to be back at ARMA. So some of you who've known me from this community will see that I'm back to my consulting gig after 4.5 years with Preservica. And so thank you to Preservica for inviting me to be part of the panel. I'm still on my soapbox about preservation, as you folks who have known me know I've been talking about this for a long time. So my role here is to add a little commentary about from the records perspective and the archival perspective. So first of all, I want to say preservation is a disposition act. And John, I want to tell you that I very much enjoyed your Merlin blogs. And the last one, titled Reimagining Retention and Disposition, really struck a chord with me, because I think that most records managers and archivists are in a constant state of reimagining retention and disposition so that it would get better and more organized, and maybe automation was beyond their dreams. But I think, as you've said, the opportunity and the challenge is right here before us. And so I'm hoping that we can find some ways to integrate preservation, but it's going to take some work. So next slide. So of course, all of you folks are experts in records lifecycle management, and we've got some great tools that help us understand what's going on with information objects that we care about. And our job in the records and information management sphere is to try to be efficient and systematic through the entire life cycle. And of course, that includes disposition. And I just make a point here that per the ISO standard, disposition is a range of processes. And I think in John's blog, he made the point of sometimes people think about disposition as destruction. And it's been a legal issue. And it's been a frustration of mine for many years that disposition came to mean destruction, and destruction came to be focused on defensible destruction. But really, there's so much that happens. It's been my privilege and honor to be engaged with now probably hundreds of different organizations to understand what they do, why they do it, the life of the assets they care about, and all the hands that are involved in that. So disposition is really everything that happens across the life cycle to make sure the right things happen, right? That the right people have access to it, that we keep it as long as we need to, that it's readable and authentic and usable and all those other sorts of things. And digital preservation is the part that really worries about keeping that authenticity and readability over the long haul, over technology, and maybe very importantly, successive generations of custodians. So I think what we're looking at in the Microsoft environment is a tremendous opportunity and challenge to get all those parts and pieces wired together. And I think the role of records and information governance practitioners is to really get deep in to disposition actions and to find ways to embed that in the rules that the systems are using. And so that's going to take a little bit of work. So next slide. So this is just an example of what I've seen over and over and over again, right? When we talk about retention and disposition schedules, often the emphasis is on the retention side, right? Keep forever, keep for 30 years with a trigger that who's going to pay attention to. So this is where I want to challenge our profession to figure out how we can wire together these disposition actions, which include preservation, into the tools we use, into the authorities that we have. So sometimes there's I work a lot with on the archives end, of course, so it's the owner, the custodian uses it, creates it, maintains it, and then at some distant point in the future, it transfers to an archives, and they're left with dealing with whatever they got, right? So I think what the opportunity here is that we can pull this way upstream into the closer to creation, into the workflows, and make the disposition, which includes preservation action, which I know that Gareth is going to talk about. What are those things that we need to do to future-proof this digital content sooner rather than later, and not just dump it into the hands of the archivists or the records custodians who are no longer probably using microfilm and storing in paper. So next slide, please. So I want to just share two case studies from Preservica during the time that I was with them to show, what the options are and where we're headed. So this is a case study of preservation for a very large government healthcare agency, a federal, central government. And the challenge was all these files in Lotus Notes that had to be kept for 30 years. So this is one option. Of course, you can wait until decommissioning, and then you can, pay the piper, employ specialists, figure out how you're going to extract from the system that you want to shut down, how you're going to transform it into a package that you will, that preservation systems can understand, and then move it into the preservation environment. So of course, this is high stakes, long-term preservation, no errors allowed, very important. People's lives are at stake here and their healthcare, and so you can do this. You can wait until the system comes offline, or you're desperate to shut off that license, or the vendor has stopped providing support. But I think what we're saying is let's do better. And as John said, as the capabilities in the Microsoft environment are coming along in ways that records managers understand, I think we can hopefully get away from this sort of situation where we wait until decommissioning to deal with preservation. So next slide, please. So this is another case study, a customer of Preservica's that has a very large open text deployment. And so this is an example of integrating to an ECM system so that they know which assets have to be kept long-term. They know things that are born permanent. They know where the legal mandates overlap to the record series. And what they've been able to do is to integrate these intelligent rules so that content in the open text system that needs preservation action is then integrated with Preservica, and that it can take care of it in the normal course of business, right? That's what we're aiming for in the records world, is let's get this preservation action and these disposition triggers wired in a new way that make records management and preservation happen in the normal course of business. And as John said, the users, we can't rely on them to do this. It doesn't work. They're distracted, but they do need to have a sense of confidence and assurance that the things that they care about will be accessible. And so there are lots of decisions to be made about how do you pull these two systems together? How do you integrate that preservation action? And next slide, and my last slide. So I want to challenge and empower and engage IG and RIM practitioners. I think you have an incredibly important role to play in this automation journey that we'll all be on as organizations. You know that sometimes the tools can't do everything we want them to do, or sometimes other stakeholders in the process might have a different schedule than we have, but I think records managers need to sort of throw themselves into this environment. And so the low burden on the user and the low risk to the organization, those outcomes will only be available, as John said, if we're able to articulate these more robust, more precise disposition actions and triggers, not just wait until 40 years and then do something. We can't do that anymore. It won't happen. Digital content is way too fragile. In the digital preservation community, we try to say if it's 10 years, if it's already been in existence 10 years, or it's a 10-year plus retention, then you ought to think about preservation action. So maybe that will give you a guideline. And I think on my soapbox, that disposition is way more than destruction or transferring responsibility way down later in the life cycle to somebody like an archivist who's an expert but has low resources and a lot of work to do to curate content that is happening upstream. And to John's point, the migration is very, very important, because when you bring things into the Microsoft environment, it's bringing a lot of metadata. There's a lot of metadata created in the O365 environment. And then there's certain metadata that has to be preserved and managed for the preservation. So all of that has to be sort of sorted out. So I think that it's an unprecedented opportunity, an incredible time, and one of challenge. So I would say that, find some good targets where they've got engaged users who understand the value of their content and can help work through some of these issues, and get some better articulation about disposition triggers that will get us the outcomes that we hope for. So with that, I'll get off my soapbox and turn over to Vivek. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Feel really privileged to be part of this panel. I'm part of InfoTection, as John explained. My focus is very much on the technology side. So all the comments and all the discussions that have happened so far, my focus really is on how can I make it practical from a technology point of view. And that's from an InfoTection point of view, focus on is to simplify the overall adoption journey for our customers, to ensure that information is reliable, is findable, and help customers develop an architectural foundation on which further advanced capabilities and advanced features can be used and built upon, but really starting up with a foundation which embeds some of these best practices, addressing those challenges early on, as we have highlighted throughout the course of this discussion. So I'll take this journey further. And if we go on to the next slide, please. I want to start with approaches related to classification, and that's my topic for today, is to understand, as organizations are looking at ways to simplify the user experience, reduce the burden on the users from organizing the information, classifying the information, and hence determining what retention, what disposition actions. There is quite a lot that needs to happen on a single piece of information in order for it to go through its entire life cycle. And the knowledge workers, the users, are really interested in actually working with the information, not necessarily identifying and classifying the information. So what you see on the screen here is kind of three approaches. The traditional classification approach, as we have seen, is that in projects or transition from current systems or current ways of working to Microsoft 365 Cloud, a traditional approach would be a system inventory, then a business-led cleanup, ROT analysis, and then business needs to work on classification. And then the migration happens to Microsoft 365, so that when it goes into SharePoint Online, or Microsoft Teams or other repositories, then it is classified. Then we can apply rules, etc., in order for then information to be ready for people to use. And the challenge there comes in where we get into the business-led activities, and especially the amount of information that has been collected in file shares and legacy platforms. The quality of classification is not always to a level where it would relate to when information needs to be moved over to Microsoft 365. Of course, the other approaches that we've seen is more accelerated, where it's lift and shift or move and improve approach, for example, where looking at the system inventory and migrate the information as is and leave it for later on to be cleaned up, to be analyzed, to be classified, and then retention, disposition, preservation controls to be applied to the information. And where we are seeing that the market is trending towards and the customers are asking for, and especially definitely where the technology is moving, is actually more intelligent ways of transforming. While focused on reducing the time it takes to get onto the Microsoft 365, both the information, the users, and the behaviors, but also at the same time, introduce and inject some intelligence in the form of leveraging machine learning and automation to identify and classify the information so that the governance and migration can actually both be done together rather than as two separate activities. As John mentioned, preservation is something that is often seen as the end of a process activity. So as records management seen often as an end of the process activity. We want to bring that right to the front to make sure that when information is migrated, information is organized and considered for classification, then that classification is informed by the records management requirements, the governance requirements, and also preservation requirements. So if we look at the next slide, please. And this is where our customers are looking for, trying to solve. They're working on building a holistic vision for information governance. So in that sense, the scope is everything, not just information which is managed in files or documents. It's in emails, it's in chats, it's in social media, it's in applications, third-party apps, and even physical records, where organizations still have dependency on paper records. And what we are trying to drive is simplicity. Is a number of these factors which you see on the screen are to be considered from a privacy by design point of view, from a compliance by design, including protection and lifecycle management. So each information needs to go through a legal assessment, records management assessment, privacy, compliance, information security, and so on and so forth. And this isn't scalable if we have to do it manually. So that's where we bring in some of the simplicity aspect and some of the solutions which help us identify, automatically detect information and indicate where information may have PII elements. It may not be a PII which is at risk, but is required for organization to keep it because they have a responsibility to manage it. On the other hand, it could be the PII data, which is expired, high risk, and hence organizations should be deleting that information in order to be compliant with the regulations. And so the strategy and approach that we're developing needs to be simple, something which people can follow easily. And the decisions on classification and preservation and disposition are somewhat made at the aggregation level instead of people having to go through and review every single file. We go on to the next slide, please. Overall, what we expect to find in the information, whether that is information sitting already in Microsoft 365 or in other content management systems or file shares or other third-party applications, kind of see this in kind of three key categories. One is the category of information that can easily be identified as something that we should delete. This could be information which is commonly known as rot, etc., but it also is information which is high risk. Could be personally identifiable information, high risk information, which organizations should have deleted a while ago. The second category is the information which is of value, active information which requires collaboration, which requires knowledge workers to access it, and hence needs to be on platforms which are more easily accessible anywhere from any device. For example, Microsoft 365, SharePoint Online, or Microsoft Teams, for example, and also expanded that into the Azure platform capabilities as well. And then the third is the category where the information isn't suitable for products like SharePoint and Microsoft 365 because they tend to be more structured in nature, seem to be applications, they seem to be multimedia files, they seem to be database files where they need appropriate storage so that they can be accessed again, but not outside of the governance control. Still the governance, preservation, record management controls can be applied to those. So that's the sort of storyline that we've been working with. And of course, a consistent way of applying all of those governance controls to the information, whether that is going to sit within Microsoft 365 or it's a structured information, structured application, structured data, not suitable for Microsoft 365 and hence needs to be managed elsewhere. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about the solution that we have developed in order to accelerate and also simplify the problem related to classification of information. And in that classification, it's of course the business classification of the information, but also keeping in mind the preservation and retention aspects to it. So this is an example of an auto classification scenario, which is quite prominent at the moment, especially where organizations are looking to replace source systems, and it could be a file share, where we bring in the Azure classification solution, which InfoTection has developed, to do the inventory of the source system. But that's a more intelligent inventory of not just looking at the file properties, but performing a deep analysis using the machine models, which have been built and trained on the industry standard data. So reflecting on that and extracting key entities from the files to identify information based on the risk, based on the preservation requirements, and identify where the information could be of value, for example, records. So overall, classifying the information spread across multiple systems into key categories, for example, active, what's the reference information, which information is for legal and regulatory purpose and hence needs to be preserved, whether preserved as a record within Microsoft 365 using retention labels in Microsoft 365, or for archival purposes, manage that in Microsoft Azure, using some of the solutions, for example, Preservica, to archive that information for long-term digital preservation scenarios, and also identify information which is not required so that the business is able to make those decisions and review those decision categories at the higher level of aggregation, folder levels or aggregation of folders, instead of reviewing file by file, and embed that with the Microsoft migration capabilities to provide a single solution, which not only migrates the information, provides the inventory of the information, analysis of the information, and classification, so that when information either goes into Azure or in Microsoft 365 SharePoint Online, then it is organized, it's classified, and then automatically actually using retention labels, sensitivity labels, and other controls, manage the life cycle of that information. Overall, our focus is to implement this as not a custom solution on Microsoft 365, but something that we see as an accelerator to optimize the migration cycle, but also for facilitating scenarios where information is already being managed in Microsoft 365 to leverage some of these capabilities to implement some intelligent classification and pair that with capabilities such as managed metadata, content types within SharePoint Online to make sure that those classifications are also surfaced within those platforms, and then integrated with search. So not only is helping the retention and preservation scenarios, but also helping the business to easily and reliably find the information. So that's all I wanted to share. Just a brief overview of the solution. And on that note, I will hand over to Gareth.
That's great. Thanks, Vivek. And hello, good morning, everyone. So as Vivek said, my name's Gareth Aiken. I'm representing Preservica here today. So thank you for all joining. And my role at Preservica is looking at the more of the commercial strategy, but in particular, how we can help make ourselves obviously successful through the success of our customers. And we've been talking about a number of challenges today, and that's what I'm going to excuse me, that's what I'm going to talk about, how we can provide collectively a number of solutions to address all of the challenges we've just been discussing. So in particular, we've been talking about how all of you expect to see significant increases in terms of the volumes of electronic records over time, of which more than half likely to be unstructured. There are many transition exercises from different ECMs into the cloud, and Microsoft itself with 365 is embracing traditional content management type solutions. And majority, more than 9 out of 10 organizations are using 365, with Teams use significantly increased over the last year or so for events that we will understand. So as we've heard, some of this, what is valuable information, will require a lot of preservation as some form of disposition action. So there's a challenge. The challenge for everyone working with all of these electronic records, and it's only going to get bigger. And as we've heard, the only way to address these challenges is effectively to address these challenges is through automation for things like classification, as Vivek's just been mentioning there, and governance. So the question is, can we automate the complete governance of all of these migration and preservation activities too? Well, of course, the answer, as I'm going to say here, is yes, or at least it will be yes very, very soon. And I'll show you what I mean. So if we look here, these are some of the Microsoft descriptions of how they look to provide information protection. There's a growing set of tools that we've heard about. And if we look in the bottom corner there, in terms of governance, you'll see that word automatic again. And so through the journey from information protection to information governance, there is increasing levels of control and focus on valuable content. And some of these tools and so on align with the different levels of licensing that Microsoft provides. So there's solutions for all different types of organization and the challenges they face. If we look at the records management circle on the side there, we can see that that is focused on very high value content. But in terms of today's discussion, there's something missing. What is it? Well, of course, it's the governance of long-term or permanent content. Maybe information that's been already created in Microsoft or has been moved within, and it's the preservation of that information in particular that I'm going to talk about now. So just to come back to the point of preservation, we've heard and talked around it. Why is it needed? And in particular, why is it needed in Microsoft environments? And overall, in summary, there is still a set of challenges around long-term risk that need to be addressed. We've heard from Laurie and Vivek of specific migration examples, the potential to automate those migrations from legacy ECMs to new platforms and archives. And from a preservation, I mean that from a non-legal sense, that leaves various challenges from being able to access that archive content, for the governance of it, for critically for the file format obsolescence and the challenges that that faces over time. So we need to address all of these challenges, but as we've heard, it needs to be addressed in a simple and potentially automated, that word again, in an automated way. So simple access for 365 users to content that's been migrated into archives from outside of Microsoft in particular, from content which is inside using non-Microsoft applications, and a consistent, and this is where we start to move into the automation areas, consistent application of the Microsoft governance policies and labels, your governance policies that you apply. And importantly as well, when that information is being managed from a preservation perspective, making sure that that is also automated, so you don't need to make the difficult decisions. You know that it's being taken care of for you to manage those file formats when they become obsolete over time, potentially making sure that you're addressing concerns around proliferation, potentially applying the rules that other organizations like NARA and Library of Congress may have for what you may be required to provide under certain policies or other regulations. And ultimately, even simple things like cost-effective archiving, to making sure that your active set is well managed, is clean, your search results are reduced and appropriate for the people who are looking for it, and it's providing you a good return on investment. So that's what we at Preservica are working to deliver. So this is just a very simple slide, but it represents the more complex concept of what we've just been discussing, hopefully in an uncomplicated way. First of all, seamless preservation. And the idea is here, it just happens. It happens automatically for the content that you identify in 365 using the interfaces, the user interfaces that you are familiar with. So you don't need to go and learn any more tools. And with that, also using the governance labels, the 365 governance labels, retention, sensitivity, maybe for PII, as Vivek was just describing there. This is the critical part. You, the records managers and information governance practitioners, you create your policies in 365, but you don't want to do that again. And so this is the type of solution that we're moving towards here. That's pretty much it. You define your rules and policies within the Microsoft information governance environment, and that's pretty much it. And importantly as well, because Preservica has always been about making sure that you can find and access the information when you need it over time, providing seamless access. So your information workers, they can find what they need when they want it, again, through the familiar 365 interfaces from which they're used to working, for example, within the SharePoint interface. And that's what I want to show you. To finish up, here's something that I think's quite exciting. It's from our innovative team of engineers. It's just part of what we're building now and what I'm talking about today. So it's just a little teaser for the type of solution we're moving towards very soon as well, and how we're helping to build and bring preservation to the Microsoft 365 environment. So what you've just seen there is real. It's not a mock-up. It's just a very simple demo of a manual action. And although we've been talking about automation, the reason why I've shown manual is because it's much easier to show something that a user might do. But although it is manual to select the information that wants to be preserved, everything after that point is taken care of in an automated way. So it shows how it can be simple, how it can be seamless, and it's all through, as I said before, the 365 user interface. So let's just go back and look at that again, in case you didn't get a chance to see it the first time. So let me just move that forward. Okay, so in this instance, the user decides they want to preserve a file. It could be a folder. They're using the inbuilt context menu within SharePoint. They select the information and it gets migrated with all of its metadata, all of its governance information, everything that might be attached to it in terms of a retention. And then from that point, Preservica automatically preserves that information, all of it that's come with it, over time, whenever a preservation action is needed, and make sure that it's accessible whenever it's needed. So based on any of the rules that are set by your records managers or information governance team, that content can be copied as a secure type of backup, which is shown here with a padlock symbol that you can see, or it's completely moved to a preservation archive to Preservica, and it's removed from SharePoint to clean everything up, as I said before, clean up your search results, reduce your active set, whatever reason you need to behind it, limit access and so on. But importantly, if that content is moved out and that same knowledge worker has the right to access the information, they can search and find that file through the 365 interface whenever they need it in future. So getting back to the question that I started with today, can we automate this complete governance and migration for all of this growth in content? And as I said, yes, we can. So from Vivek's automation of migration options across ECMs and into 365, as it says there, soon we'll add manual actions through, as we've just seen there, for automated preservation as shown, semi and fully automated preservation. So that works in a very similar way, except as I mentioned, we can now trigger all of this either by applying one of your retention labels or sensitivity labels to content, or importantly, if you have the ability to use Microsoft's auto classification, those same labels can trigger the action Preservica needs to take hold of that content and make sure it's preserved and managed effectively. So it's all through your retention and sensitivity labels, all through your own information governance policies. And as I said, you can search or surface, as Microsoft likes to describe, any of that content which has come from 365 itself, or potentially has already been migrated into Preservica because the decision was made to do so into the archive earlier. And all of that can be surfaced through the Microsoft interface. And my final point is, it's not just SharePoint. It's all of these other places that you can see here where your valuable content lives, including Teams. So I think that's all from me. Just to say that hopefully you can see that all of these challenges we faced have now become much, much easier to address. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, everybody. We have time for some questions, and they've popped up here. And so I'll direct the questions to someone, but the other members of the panel, if you have 2 cents that you want to chime in on the question, give me a little high sign or hand sign, something like that, because I think these questions, I think all of you have a little bit of perspective on. So the first one is might be initially targeted at Vivek, which is a question of how are retention periods applied and configured within M365? Just in a nutshell, how does that work?
So that is actually leveraging the native capability in Compliance Center, which is either retention policies or leveraging retention labels. And then based on the licensing, that capability that you have available, as Gareth mentioned, you can either use the manual labeling option, or with some of the advanced features, auto labeling or auto classification features, which can be based on either keywords, patterns, or now even with some of the machine learning capabilities.
Anybody else on that? Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, no, just in agreement, as and from our perspective, whichever approach you use just means it's your labels, and Preservica takes care of whatever action you require to be enacted based on the labels you've applied.
This is a question which was near and dear to me based on a personal thing. My wife and I were looking through this big box that had VHS tapes in it, and it's a question related to file format obsolescence. And how do you prevent that? This, maybe you mentioned it, Gareth. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. And is there a specific format? I know from my AIM days, we were very involved in the PDFA movement, and also in defining standards for TIFF. But what are your thoughts on file format obsolescence?
Well, I mean, that's a really interesting question, and I have seen it asked this way before. And I think the answer is there isn't one format for long-term preservation, because it depends on what it is you want to achieve. So there are many different types of formats that you might want to migrate across, to open formats, to other maybe accessible formats, to formats where if you want to maintain dynamic content. It really depends on the types of use cases that you have. And also the important thing to recognize is that the right format might change over time. And that's one of the critical things that within Preservica, that when with our auto preservation, is that as the new tools, the new formats and the new technologies become available over time, there might be a better format for long-term preservation in 5 years, in 10 years, and the auto preservation will take care of it, so you don't have to. So it really depends on the types of information you've got and what you want to achieve. But there is one other thing to mention as well. I talked about policies from NARA and Library of Congress, and there are lots of bodies out there who look at this and who will provide guidance and recommendations on, depending on the types of source content you have, what you want to do with it, how they recommend that you migrate or preserve those file formats into different versions. So you can look to others, organizations like ourselves. We have our own rule set. NARA provides theirs, Library of Congress. So there's lots of people out there who provide expert advice on this.
Lori, you had a take on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Gareth said, which is if you're looking for some advice, probably the U.S. National Archives or Library of Congress is a good place to go. But as Gareth said, there's no silver bullet, there's no one file format, there never will be. And so it's a rolling situation. So inside a preservation system, what happens is that when content's ingested, it does a characterization. And I worked on a job aid that ARMA has now and Preservica have published, which is about how to future-proof an electronic record. And it talks about the process of what happens is that characterization against a registry, so you know what it is you're dealing with. And then over time, as you need to migrate it, it can be done inside the system. Or as Gareth said, just because when people come online, they want to be able to render files without the original application, and that can be done. So There's no one answer, and it's an ongoing challenge, but there are some good solutions and good advice, and it's just something that we have to continue to pay attention to. So great question. Thank you for that.
Lori, this was a question that perhaps started with one of your slides, which was basically the slide that showed the retention schedule with an event-based retention. And this person said that event-based retention is the bane of my existence. How do I convince people to move away from this?
That's pretty challenging. I mean, I think that you know, IG professionals and records managers have a lot of convincing and engaging to do with users to get them comfortable with what's going on. So, right, I think it's some deep conversations about what really needs to happen and how can we manage it. What's the desired outcome we have of this content? Who's going to need it down, you know, into the future, and how can we make better sense of it? So a really good example is what we call records that are born permanent. And so, you know, an example we see all the time are land records in the US. Anything that's real property related is almost permanent. So it gets recorded and then you know you have to keep it forever. So why not take some action then, as opposed to the typical, which is, you know, leave it in the register recorder office until a certain point, and then take care of it. So I think we have to just put it on the table and engage people in what can we do better, what's your desired outcome, and can we move away from these rules that we can't really enforce well. And then also look at what can be automated. I mean, there are some ways that we can probably do a better job of event-based triggers than in the past with some of the power that's in the environments that we're now using. So good question, ongoing challenge.
Anybody else?
I think I'll just add to that. I think one key part of simplifying event retention is to also find you know, other customers who have actually gone through that journey. So specific retention periods where they have find a way to working with their legal and regulators actually simplify and take some of those approaches, which as Lori mentioned. There are certain type of events which you know, cannot be converted into something else, things like employee files, personnel records, but the governance of that can be controlled through processes, establishing processes, and also automation, especially with Microsoft 365 now. There is advanced automation available where you can integrate systems or applications where the events happen. So for example, employee file or employee information is employee people management systems, where if somebody leaves the company can actually automatically trigger an event which can automatically go and actually find such information in Microsoft 365 and update the event date, for example. So definitely worth exploring those options as well, where you know that you cannot convert them into any other type, but definitely look for automation opportunities.
And I have one last question from the audience, and then I'll ask each of you for a final thought before we close out. So you might want to be thinking about that. And this question has to do with automated versus manual disposition. And the question had to do with the difficulty, and the phrase that caught somebody's attention was your generations of custodians. Lori, is this notion of, okay, you know, how do you get rid of this manual thing at the end 40 years hence or 50 years hence, when you have no guarantee that anybody is going to even look at it, and you know, represents a future bottleneck that you just can't even anticipate? How do you get that process of disposition automated? Anybody?
I think, I mean, I really think we have to engage the users and find the real reason behind what they want to accomplish. So, you know, it's easy to think of records that have to be around for a long time. So let's say engineering or infrastructure or transportation, where an engineer creates something, or in the utility industry where I worked, and it's not for 20 years until you need to go back to that infrastructure and make changes. And so I think, you know, the real the genius and the power of the records management profession is they have developed relationships and they're seen as trusted advisors. And I think we have to get to understand what users really care about and to translate that into some of these rules so that we can get the desired outcomes without having to go through the machinations or give in to the sometimes unreasonable will of users in order to maintain content. So I think we have to raise it up to the, what is the organization's rationale and needs, and to bake that in so that the users are comfortable, but we don't have to go through some of these ridiculous cycles of the users holding us hostage to silly rules, right? So I think it's going to take some conversation and some engagement, and then leveraging the tools that Vivek has talked about. Bake it in, and then it's just a done deal, I hope.
All righty, let me ask each of you for, one final thought that you want to stick in people's heads during our final 3 minutes before we adjourn. And who wants to go first?
I can go first. I think my thought is that, often we look at preservation, classification, disposition, protection as all separate disciplines, often as separate initiatives within organizations. And I think what we want to actually look at is holistically. Yes, each one of those may be separate steps along the way, but you still need to build a single roadmap. And hence focusing on building an architectural foundation where these controls, these policies are baked in, even if they are not implemented, but at least you have a single holistic view of how the target state would look like with classification, retention, and all of those different capabilities which are coming out into the product. So that's sort of my take on it.
Lori, why don't you go next, and then I'll give Gareth the final word.
So I would encourage folks who are listening, and just records manager and IG professionals, to really dig into and find out what is happening in preservation. So we know preservation in the microfilm and paper world. We know the controls, the processes. I think that we need to really embrace education for folks to understand what is it that has to happen in the preservation of digital objects. It's complex, but it's well known. And this road has been paved by a lot of people over the last several decades, and it's now within our grasp. So I would say step up, educate yourself in order to be in those conversations which say, this is what we need to do, this is what we can do. Thank you.
Gareth, final word.
Thank you. And actually, I'll just extend on what Laurie and Vivek are saying there. And actually, the point that I think you started with, John, today, where you said it's important to be able to start somewhere. So as we just heard, and I think everyone knows, preservation previously was often considered complex and difficult. And what do you do? How do you manage all the file formats, etc., and the policies? And on top of that, there's procedures for how do you transfer custody and content and ownership. What I can say is, from the people who we're working with to bring our solution to market now, we're hearing that actually we're making all of this a lot easier. So that's what I'd sum up with. I'd say that if you are, like many people now, starting to manage your information, your records, your information governance within the Microsoft domain, it's now even easier to start somewhere.
So thank you all very much for being on the panel. Audience, thank you for being with us here today. If you need more information, make sure you go to preservica.com or infotection.com, and you'll find a host of resources that are really helpful in your journey. So I enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you very much for being with us.